All right, ready to dive deep. Today we're doing something a little different. We're going to tackle a subject you might think you already know inside and out Scientology. But trust me, even if you've read all the headlines and watched all the documentaries, we're going to uncover some nuggets that'll make you rethink what you thought you knew.
That's the beauty of explaining it to a genius. You can skip the surface level and really dig into those unexpected connections and hidden depths.
Exactly. And speaking of hidden depths, let's talk about the man behind it all, L. Ron Hubbard. Pulp fiction writer, war veteran, and as our sources suggest, a guy with a deep fascination with mysticism and the occult. You wouldn't exactly put those on a resume for starting a religion, would you?
What's fascinating here is how those seemingly disparate threads weave their way into the fabric of Scientology. You can see echoes of Hubbard's adventurous life and his pulp fiction sensibilities throughout the religion's doctrines and practices.
Okay, so let's rewind to the beginning. We have Hubbard's childhood, made a blood brother by a Blackfoot medicine man at 6 years old, sailing the world with a Freudian Navy commander as a teenager. The guy lived a real-life adventure story before he even started writing them.
And those experiences clearly fueled his imagination. Hubbard cranked out pulp fiction stories at an astonishing rate, writing about everything from interplanetary travel to ancient civilizations. This knack for creating vivid, imaginative worlds is something that definitely carries over into Scientology, particularly with its more, shall we say, cosmic elements.
Right, and that brings us to Dianetics, the foundation upon which Scientology was built. Now, you're probably familiar with the basics of the reactive mind, engrams auditing, but what's really intriguing is how Hubbard used specific anecdotes, like the story of John Brodie, to popularize these concepts.
The story of John Brodie, the famous NFL quarterback who supposedly healed a chronic arm injury through Dianetic auditing, is a perfect example. Now, whether or not the healing was actually due to Dianetics is debatable, but what's important is the impact this story had on early adopters. It gave Dianetics an air of legitimacy, especially within the realm of sports and physical performance.
It's almost like a prototype for those celebrity endorsements that would become so central to Scientology later on.
Exactly. And that brings us to the evolution from Dianetics to Scientology, a transition that wasn't exactly smooth sailing. Hubbard initially resisted the concept of past lives, worried it would undermine his carefully constructed system.
He even called people who believed in past lives nuts, which is ironic considering where Scientology ends up.
The irony isn't lost on me. But eventually, perhaps realizing the potential of past lives to expand the scope and appeal of his teachings, Hubbard embraced the idea. And that's where the concept of the thetans enters the picture. Now, most people think of a thetan as basically a soul, but it's much more complex than that.
Yeah, the idea that we're not actually human beings, but these powerful spiritual entities trapped in physical bodies is pretty mind-blowing, even for someone who's heard it before.
And it's this concept of the thetan that elevates Scientology from a self-help system focused on individual trauma to a cosmic drama spanning lifetimes and galaxies.
Okay, so we've got a charismatic founder with a flair for storytelling, a set of intriguing, if somewhat unconventional beliefs, and now enter stage, left the Sea Org. This is where things start to get really interesting.
The Sea Org, Scientology's elite paramilitary organization, plays a pivotal role in the religion's history. Founded on a ship, imagine that an entire religious order living and working at sea. It was on this ship that Hubbard developed some of Scientology's most controversial practices and doctrines, including the infamous OT3 level.
Speaking of OT3, that's one of those things that even people outside of Scientology have heard whispers about. It's shrouded in secrecy, and the details are, well, let's just say, pretty out there.
It's definitely one of the most perplexing aspects of Scientology. The OT3 level is when Scientologists are supposedly exposed to the story of Xenu, the galactic overlord, who brought billions of beings to Earth and then nuked them, scattering their souls, which then became attached to humans. It's a wild tale, even within the context of science fiction.
And here's where it gets even more fascinating.
Yeah.
Hubbard, despite creating this incredibly elaborate and imaginative cosmology, actually had a deep distrust of psychiatry and psychology.
That's one of the great contradictions within Scientology. On the one hand, you have this incredibly complex system that draws on concepts from science fiction and mysticism. But on the other hand, you have Hubbard vehemently rejecting established scientific and medical fields, particularly those related to mental health.
So it's a system that borrows from science fiction but rejects actual science. That's a tricky line to walk.
It is, and it's something that's been a source of controversy for Scientology from the very beginning.
Okay, so we've got Dianetics as the foundation, Scientology as the cosmic expansion, and the Sea Org as the driving force. What's next in this wild ride?
Well, let's not forget the celebrities. From its early days, Scientology has been remarkably successful at attracting famous faces, and those celebrities have played a key role in shaping public perception of the religion, both positive and negative.
Yeah, celebrity and controversy, those two seem to go hand in hand with Scientology.
Right.
It's a religion that's never been far from the headlines.
And that fascination with celebrity, as we'll see, becomes even more pronounced in the post-Hubbard era. But that, my friend, is a story for part two. So we left off with Scientology poised to enter a new era, the post-Hubbard era. And leading the charge is a figure who, in many ways, is just as enigmatic and controversial as Hubbard himself, David Miscavige.
Miscavige. Now, there's a name that's synonymous with Scientology's modern image. For better or worse, I always find it fascinating how someone who started in the Sea Org as a teenager could rise to become the leader of this global organization.
His rise to power is a story in itself. But what's particularly intriguing is how his leadership style shaped the direction of Scientology, where Hubbard was perhaps more of a visionary, a grand storyteller. Miscavige is known for his intense focus on control and efficiency.
And that control manifested in some pretty well unsettling ways. The Hole, for example. We touched on this earlier, but it's worth diving a bit deeper. It was basically a makeshift prison camp on Scientology's gold base, right?
That's right. Former members have described it as a place where high-ranking officials who fell out of favor with Miscavige were sent for punishment and reindoctrination, and the conditions were reportedly brutal. Physical and psychological abuse, forced confessions, even sleep deprivation.
Okay, but let's play devil's advocate for a second. Some Scientologists defend the Hole, right? They claim it's a voluntary program for those seeking spiritual rehabilitation.
Yes, that's the official line from the church. They frame it as a way for dedicated members to confront their ethical shortcomings and recommit to Scientology's principles. But the accounts from those who have escaped the Hole paint a very different picture, one of coercion, intimidation, and outright abuse.
It's a stark contrast to the image Scientology tries to project, isn't it? This emphasis on self-improvement, on achieving spiritual freedom.
Absolutely. And this internal conflict, this dissonance between Scientology's stated ideals and the realities of its practices is something that becomes increasingly apparent under Miscavige's leadership.
And this is all happening while Tom Cruise, Scientology's most famous adherent, is reaching new heights of stardom. It's almost a parallel narrative, isn't it? Miscavige consolidating his power, the church facing growing scrutiny, and Cruise becoming this global icon.
The relationship between Miscavige and Cruise is fascinating. They clearly have a deep bond, and Cruise's unwavering loyalty to Scientology has been a huge boon for the church's public image. But there's also a sense that Miscavige has gone to great lengths to cater to Cruise's needs and desires, further solidifying his influence within the organization.
We even have sources mentioning that Cruise's personal life, particularly his relationships, were heavily influenced by the church.
There have been allegations that the church played a role in ending some of Cruise's marriages, even going so far as to audition potential partners for him. Now, it's difficult to confirm the validity of these claims, but they definitely fuel the perception of Scientology as an organization that exerts an extraordinary level of control over its members, particularly those in the public eye.
And then we have Paul Haggis, a Hollywood heavyweight and longtime Scientologist who has a very public and very messy break with the church. What was his breaking point?
Haggis's story is particularly compelling because he was a true believer for decades. He credits Scientology with helping him overcome drug addiction and achieving success in his career. But his disillusionment began with the church's stance on Proposition 8, the ballot measure that banned same-sex marriage in California. Haggis, who has a gay daughter, was deeply troubled by the church's support for the ban.
But wasn't the church's position more nuanced than that? They claimed to be neutral on the issue, focusing on religious freedom rather than taking a side.
That's how they framed it publicly. But Haggis, having been a high-ranking member, saw through the spin. He recognized that the church's actions, particularly their internal communications, and the pressure they put on members to support the ban, spoke louder than their official statements. And this, for Haggis, was a betrayal of the very principles he believed Scientology stood for.
It's a classic example of how personal values can clash with institutional ideology. And in Haggis's case, it led to a complete break, not just a quiet departure. He became a very vocal critic, publicly denouncing the church and supporting other former members who were speaking out.
His decision to speak out was incredibly courageous. He knew he would face backlash, potentially legal action, and damage to his reputation. But he felt a moral obligation to expose what he saw as the church's hypocrisy and abuse.
And his voice, combined with the growing chorus of other critics, fueled by the rise of the internet and social media, created a real PR nightmare for Scientology. They could no longer control the narrative in the same way they had before.
The internet was a game changer. It allowed former members to connect with each other, to share their stories, and to build a community of support that existed outside of the church's control. And it provided a platform for critical voices, journalists, and investigators to shine a light on Scientology's practices in a way that had never been possible before.
It's interesting how technology can both empower and challenge institutions, isn't it? In Scientology's case, it seems to have done both.
Absolutely. And as we'll see in part 3, this tension between control and exposure becomes even more pronounced in the years following Haggis's departure. The internet becomes a battleground with the church, using its resources to try and silence critics, while former members and activists use it to spread awareness and demand accountability.
So we've got this perfect storm brewing, a controversial leader, growing dissent, and the internet fanning the flames.
Yeah.
What happens next?
Well, things really come to a head in 2009 with the launch of Anonymous's Project Chinology. Remember Anonymous, that loose collective of hacktivists?
Oh, yeah, those guys.
Yeah.
They were all over the news back then. Weren't they known for taking down websites and disrupting online systems?
Exactly. They were a force to be reckoned with, and they turned their attention to Scientology, launching a series of protests, both online and offline, aimed at exposing the church's practices and demanding reform.
So how did Scientology respond to this new kind of adversary?
Well, initially, they were used to dealing with individual critics or journalists, people they could intimidate or sue into silence. But Anonymous was decentralized, anonymous, and relentless.
It's like trying to swat at a swarm of bees.
The perfect analogy. They tried to fight back with their usual tactics, legal threats, denial, even attempting to hack anonymous members. But it backfired spectacularly. It only drew more attention to the issue, and more people started digging into the allegations against Scientology.
So Project Chinology really opened the floodgates. It made it much harder for the church to control the narrative.
And this is where we see the real impact of the internet on institutions like Scientology. It's not just about information being more accessible, it's about the power shifting away from centralized authorities towards networks of individuals.
We see this happening with the governments, corporations, and now religions.
Yeah.
The old playbook doesn't work as well anymore.
Right. And Scientology, with its history of secrecy and control, was particularly ill-equipped to handle this new reality. They tried to adapt, of course. They launched their own websites and social media accounts, attempted to engage with critics online, but it often came across as tone-deaf or even aggressive.
It's tough to change your image when your actions speak louder than your words.
Exactly. And those actions continue to draw scrutiny, particularly the allegations of abuse and exploitation within the Sea Org. We see high-profile defections like actress Leah Remini, who became a vocal critic and produced a documentary series exposing the church's practices.
And then there were the investigations by law enforcement and journalists digging into claims of human trafficking, financial irregularities, and even forced separation of families.
The church denied everything, of course, dismissing the accusations as lies spread by disgruntled ex-members, but the cracks were starting to show.
So where does that leave Scientology today? It's clearly not the same organization it was in Hubbard's era, or even Miscavige's early days.
It's at a crossroads, I'd say. They still have a dedicated following, including some celebrities, but their membership has reportedly declined, and they're facing more scrutiny than ever before.
What's interesting to me is that despite all the controversy, all the negative press, Scientology still manages to endure. What do you think accounts for that?
Well, there are several factors at play. First, their belief system, while unconventional, offers a sense of purpose and belonging. It provides answers to life's big questions and promises spiritual enlightenment. Second, their community is tightly knit, offering support and a sense of shared identity. And third, let's not forget the power of sunk cost. Many members have invested years, even decades of their lives, and significant amounts of money into Scientology. Leaving would mean admitting they were wrong, which is incredibly difficult for anyone to do.
So it's a complex mix of belief community and a reluctance to walk away from a significant investment.
Exactly. And that makes Scientology a fascinating case study in the dynamics of belief and the resilience of institutions, even in the face of intense criticism.
It's a story that's still unfolding, and it will be interesting to see how Scientology navigates the challenges of the 21st century. But for now, I think we've done a pretty good job of unpacking this complex and often controversial religion.
We've gone from Hubbard's pulp fiction origins to the cosmic realms of the Thuttons, from the Sea Org's maritime adventures to the rise of Miscavige and the internet's disruptive force. It's been quite a journey.
It has. And for all you geniuses out there, I'll leave you with this. Scientology shows us that the power of belief can be both inspiring and dangerous. It can drive people to great lengths for better or worse. And it reminds us that critical thinking and independent inquiry are essential, no matter how alluring a belief system might seem.
Well said. And on that note, it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.